Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Financially free versus debt-free. Which one is better? Today, rather than me hosting the show, I'll be interviewed by two podcast hosts. We debate. They largely take the debt-free side, and I the financially free side, today on Get Rich Education. MC Lobsher is the host of the Cashflow Ninja podcast and president of Producers Wealth. He is on a mission to help you achieve financial independence and freedom as soon as possible. He achieves this by integrating the infinite banking concept with real estate investments to increase your returns and recapture cash flow that you are not even aware of that you're losing. MC shares the number one strategy of investors in his holistic wealth creation course at yourownbankingsystem.com.
Would you like to know the easiest way to create wealth and passive income with real estate? This is Marco Santarelli with Norada Real Estate Investments. Now you can access the best deals without the stress or hassle of having to find, renovate, or manage those properties. We save you time by providing you with passive income investment properties in some of the best U.S. markets. Learn more by downloading your free copy of The Ultimate Guide to Passive Real Estate Investing. There's no obligation and nothing to buy. Simply visit passiverealestateguide.com and get your free copy today. That's passiverealestateguide.com.
Get Rich Education is brought to you by Ridge Lending Group, Producers Wealth, Norada Real Estate, and Total Control Financial.
You're listening to the show that has created more passive income for people than nearly any show in the world. This is the powerful Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Astana, Kazakhstan to Austin, Texas, and across 188 nations worldwide. You're inside Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Besides hosting Get Rich Education, I appear as a guest on quite a few other investing shows, and recently one appearance stands out to me, and I want to share it with you. Now, on most shows, I probably come off as a rather polished guest, but instead of playing one of those for you here, it's going to be a lot more interesting for you to hear about how it sounds when a show host, or two in this case, simultaneously push back. And late in the interview, one even says, "I'm pushing back." They basically say, debt-free sounds pretty good to me. I'm not sure if I want to dismiss debt-free quite so fast. Now, some of the material you've heard me talk about on the show before, so that's a review. Other material is all new. The part of this interview where I discuss with the hosts the 5 simultaneous profit centers that you often have as a leveraged cash flowing real estate investor, that's been cut out of this interview because I've discussed that rather recently here on the show with you. This show is hosted by Seth Williams and his co-host Jaron Barnes. You might remember Seth. He's been on the show here as your GRE guest twice. He's an expert in real estate productivity apps and websites, and in raw land investing. Seth is also a terrific writer, and they're both really good guys. One or both of them have read my book, 7 Money Myths, so they have some good context for this discussion. Now, I know that I'm speaking to the initiated here, so briefly before we play this, you already know why home equity is unsafe, illiquid, and its rate of return is always zero. For example, if you own a $300,000 property and you owe $200,000 on the mortgage, you have $100,000 in equity. Well, if that $300K property appreciates up to $400K over time, congratulations. But that appreciation had nothing to do with the fact that you have $100K of equity in it. Nothing to do with it at all. It's completely independent. That's why home equity has an ROI of 0. Now, conversely, in a second scenario, if you have this same $300K home with $100K of equity in it, and your $300K home depreciates in value down to $200K, well, now what happened to your equity? It's 100% gone. A total wipeout. It was left 100% exposed to the market, and now you see why home equity is unsafe. If you put additional equity in a home, not only are you working against some of the lowest interest rate, cheapest debt that you can get, you're also sinking dollars into a vehicle that does not provide you with any income. But now, with all that being said, borrowing against home equity, that still exacts an interest rate expense against you. So there is more to consider here. Let's talk about it. And I'm going to come back after this interview to give you so much more commentary about it and also give you some long-term perspective on your own plans for equity, debt, and your financial future.
Hello, everybody. How's it going? This is Seth from retipster.com. I'm here with my co-host, Jaron Barnes. Our special guest today, episode 29, is Keith Weinhold. And Keith is a guy that I first got acquainted with, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago now. Keith has a lot of stuff going on. He's a member of the Forbes Real Estate Council. He's an international best-selling author. He's actually the guy that let me know about the coffee farm opportunity if you heard episode 27. The only reason I know about that is because of Keith. So Keith also runs a website called GetRichEducation.com, where there's a blog. He also has a podcast under the same name, where he's teaching readers and listeners all about real estate investing, financial freedom, and how to foster the right financial mindset. And what I really like about Keith is that he's got this way of asking the right questions that kind of challenge the way I think. There's all kinds of these weird assumptions that I've always made in my financial life about like debt and saving and like how you get ahead. He's one of these minds that just knows how to get you to see things from a different angle, which is really, really powerful. So Keith, welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
Well, good day. Great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm super excited to have you on here too. I've heard a lot about you and I'm really looking forward to diving deep, man, getting to know who you are. And yeah, so to kick this thing off, like, how did you get started in real estate? What's your background story? I love to say like your superhero origin story, you know?
Well, I don't know how heroic it is. I've never worn a cape. I was born and raised in upstate Pennsylvania, and I was born in a lower middle class family in Appalachia. And, you know, my mom kind of instilled the lessons of frugality. She was clipping coupons for Cheerios cereal for 10 cents. It was really my dad, who worked a day job, who was never into anything entrepreneurial or real estate-ish, but he just kind of instilled in me, you know, Keith, don't live to get paid to live. If you're working at a job that you're not passionate about, you don't need to let that define you. So even though we lived a somewhat frugal lifestyle, one great thing my parents did is they really instilled this sense of travel in us. So we did travel well. One of the places I ended up traveling was to Alaska. I ended up vacationing there 4 times, kind of coming out of my teens and into college. And it really started to get into me that Anchorage, Alaska is the place that fits my lifestyle interests for things like mountaineering and skiing. So I relocated from Pennsylvania to Anchorage more than 15 years ago. And I was just working at a day job, but I had kind of fallen in with a group of friends that I'll call aspirational friends. I think you might be familiar with the Jim Rohn quote, "You are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with." Take your 5 closest friends, average their ethics, average their spirituality, average their physical fitness, average their income that they make, and that's probably pretty close to your average. So 2 of my 5 friends, once I had relocated to Anchorage, I knew that they had made their first home a 4-plex building where they had lived in 1 unit and rented out the other 3. Well, this seemed kind of daunting to me. I didn't have a lot of money to start, like most people. I was really young. But I found out by doing what they did, with an FHA loan and a 3.5% down payment, I could buy a building as big as a 4-plex. 4 units is as large as you can do this with, live in 1 unit, and rent out the other 3. So that's what I ended up doing, because I kind of had this comfort zone or this frame of reference that 2 friends were doing it. And you know what, Seth and Jaron? I didn't even know what terms like cash flow and equity meant until I had owned the building for a while. So talk about starting a little bit before you're ready. All I really knew was I was living for free with the 3 rent incomes minus all the property expenses, including the mortgage. That's how I started with a bang, with a 4-plex building for $295,000 more than 15 years ago in Midtown Anchorage.
I don't know, other than you, I don't know any real estate investors or really anybody who's doing business in Anchorage. How big is that city? Like, how many people live there?
300,000 people. So
Okay.
in fact, 40 to 45% of the entire state's population lives in this one city.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Interesting. Something that you talk about is the differences between the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy. And I know these are pretty big generalizations that there's, these three different groups in society. In your opinion, what is it that makes somebody poor or middle class or wealthy? If somebody is born to one of those groups and they want to migrate to one that is more on the wealthy side, like what do they have to do to change that?
Well, that's a good question. And you're really right. This is sort of nebulous and mindset-ish, but this is going to set up what we talk about a little bit later. Socioeconomically, there are basically three groups of people in the world: poor, middle class, and wealthy. What do poor people do? They work for money, and they really don't have any money left over to invest. What do middle class people do? Middle class people, they also work for money. They typically have money left over to invest, but here's the real paradigm shift. Middle class people think, what is the best and highest use of my investing dollar? It's to get my money to work for me. And they just kind of go back to work and put their head down. But here's the difference. Wealthy people, they don't just get their money to work for them. Wealthy people ethically get other people's money to work for them. And the great thing is everyday people can ethically employ other people's money. In fact, I began doing it young with the fourplex building, even though I didn't really understand it that well yet. So the way a person can become wealthy, even though they're coming from normal means, is to use other people's money three ways at the same time, in fact, with real estate. The first way is with the bank's money. You use the bank's money for a loan and leverage. I told you, for example, back on the fourplex, I only used a 3.5% down payment. All the rest of the money was the bank's money. Secondly, I use the tenant's money for that monthly income stream, that cash flow, to service the debt and to provide a passive income stream for me. And the third of three ways I use other people's money at the same time is I use the government's money for very generous tax incentives. And the more properties and units you have, you do this at scale. Tax incentives include things like a 1031 tax-deferred exchange, which means you legally never need to pay capital gains tax on any of your real estate gains. I legally never have. And other tax advantages like something called depreciation, which means a portion of your rent income is sheltered from tax. So the takeaway is wealthy employ not just their money, but other people's money three ways at the same time: the banks, the tenants, and the governments. That's the difference. That's how you get ahead.
So why do you tell people to stop looking at property? I mean, obviously, if you're in real estate, right? Like, people should be looking at property. So why do you tell people that?
That's a great question. I wrote a popular blog article. I think it was just titled, Jaron, it was titled, Stop Looking at Property. And people were like, well, after talking to you, Keith, I'm all excited in buying property and getting started. And here's my point. Whoa. Slow down. Don't start with the property. I think that's how a lot of people that get into real estate end up having a very bad experience, because they began with the property. They might have even let emotions get into it. I'll just give you an example. Say that you're a commuter and you commute both ways to work every day, and you've kind of heard real estate investing is a good thing to be into, and a lot of times you don't really know how that works, and you drive by this pretty yellow duplex both ways to and from work, and it's always painted nicely, and it has nice shutters, and the landscaping is all pristine, and one day you see a for sale sign on it, and you figure, oh, well, it looks like that place is very nice, and I could manage it myself. I drive by it twice a day, so probably look into that and buy that. Well, I think you're really making a mistake, because you started by looking at property. In fact, in real estate investing, I contend that the property is only the fourth most important thing. The most important thing is you. What does Jaron want? What does Seth want? What do you want? Do you want a property to provide you with appreciation potential or tax advantages or some kind of lifestyle benefit that you could get out of it and use yourself? Or do you want it to provide you with cash flow, which is probably the most common answer? But what do you want the property to do for you? You are number one in this. The second most important thing is what market is going to support that. And that might be a geographic market, or we might be talking about use type as well, whether that's an assisted living home or a residential single-family home or an apartment. You know, what market are we talking about? You want to have a market that has diverse economic sectors, because, for example, if you're buying for cash flow, you're going to need to be sure that there's a tenant with a job, or this whole thing doesn't work. So the second most important thing is the market. The third most important thing is that team of professionals that you surround yourself with, especially that property manager. That's the glue that makes this whole thing work. That's what makes this income relatively passive. And then fourthly, and only fourthly, do I begin looking at property, because if the first three things don't work, you, the market, and the team, then the property really won't work either. So I think if one steps back from looking at property and gets patient and gets congruent with what they want this property to do for them, they're really going to set themselves up for success.
I want to dive into what you do when setting up a team, because I feel like, at least in my world in real estate, that can be one of the most challenging aspects. Is how do you find people that you can trust, especially like, you being in Alaska and you have properties in Texas, you're out of state a lot of the times. I know you have local properties as well, but like, how do you find people that you can trust?
Referrals is the short answer. I do attend networking events, a lot of times live in-person real estate events, and there's just nothing better than getting a testimonial from a real person. And how did property management company XYZ in Tampa, how are they really doing for you? How communicative are they? Do they make a bunch of extraneous repairs on a property that you have to pay for? Can they keep your unit occupied? I think the power of the referral, and it doesn't always have to be in person, is the most valuable way to find out about that team, especially that manager that makes this whole thing work.
I just fired my property manager 2 days ago and found a new one. And first time I've ever done that. This property manager, they actually weren't terrible. They just weren't keeping my units up to the standard that I want. When I go visit them, I don't want to be embarrassed that I'm making people live in there. And they were sort of getting to that territory a little bit. But ultimately, I think what the issue came down to was communication. It was really hard for me to get answers on is the unit occupied? Who is it occupied by? When is the lease going to end? Just basic stuff like that. And this new property manager I have has this online portal with all that information that's really easy to access. But I agree. I mean, especially if you're not going to be managing them yourself, which I think if you're going to scale, you sort of have to start doing that. You can't really overstate the importance of good property management. I mean, it doesn't work without that.
It's really difficult otherwise, and you could never make it passive, and you can't make yourself scalable unless you have a manager. But yeah, you're right, Seth. They need to be communicative, and I think it shows some ethics on your part as well. I mean, we talk about using other people's money. We're not talking about using people. I mean, I want to provide housing that's clean, safe, affordable, and functional. That's part of my mission. It's probably pretty close to your mission, and that manager's importance can't be overstated. If I don't have a good manager in a market, I'm not even going to buy property there.
In a way, I actually almost sort of feel for the property manager, because I think what they have to balance is some of their clients do want the units to be really nice and spotless and perfect. Other clients don't really care. They just want to make as much money, as squeeze everything they can. So it's they have to deal with different expectations from everybody. I mean, I'm sure there's a way to gauge what those expectations are and manage that a little bit, but I can totally see how that would be a challenge from their end.
I would never personally ever want to own a property management company. When I talk to turnkey guys and I talk to property managers, the stuff that they have to, they work 24 hours. They call all the time, and they have systems in place. But if 2:00 in the morning they get an emergency call and they can't get anybody, and their emergency contact's not picking up, they're on the hook. They got to figure it out, and they don't actually make that much money. And they have to scale to a certain point before it's even that profitable. So it's a tough business for sure.
Yeah, I would think. If I was somebody who had no money or very little and couldn't go out and just buy a bunch of my own properties, if I was willing to work really hard for a long time, it could totally make sense, because you can basically make money from other people's assets that way. But I agree. I mean, it doesn't sound appealing to me at all. That's the kind of work I wouldn't want to sign up for, but that's just me.
Exactly. I think property management is probably the toughest part of the real estate investing business. And being on the best side is the side I've chosen, being the investor. Property management is called property management, but it really ought to be called tenant management, because that's where the stress comes in. And oftentimes it comes down to personalities and temperament, and as a manager, when you deal with that friction, sometimes face to face with a tenant, it can be very easy to either come down too hard on that tenant and upset them, or come down too easy on the tenant and get walked all over. So there aren't very many people that have just that right temperament in that middle range that can deal with tenant problems.
how did you do it when you actually lived in the property? Like when you had that fourplex and you were living there, did you let your tenants know that you were the actual owner? Like I've heard different takes on that. How did you walk that fine line?
Awesome question. So looking back, when I started, yes, I owned that fourplex building. I lived in one unit, rented out the other three, and I learned an awful lot of lessons. I'm not even very handy, but I think that my tenants could see that, oh, I was so upset if they had a big problem and their faucet or their drain had a leak and I didn't know how to repair it. And I think I showed them that I'm really concerned and we'll get someone over here to fix it for you right away. And yeah, life was not always convenient when I'm living right there, because one of the things you do is, on the sidewalk right outside your building, you may very well run into your tenant. And there's a good part in that, and there's a bad part in that. The good part in that is I want to know if the faucet drain is leaking, because that might be ruining some subfloor or something else. The downside of that is you might run into a tenant that's ticky-tacky, and you're the on-site manager, and you live there yourself. You might very well get the tenant that said, oh, Keith, yesterday I saw an ant crawling across the counter, so I want you to call an exterminator. Or, my kitchen cabinet doors are a little loose again. I know you were in here 6 weeks ago, but will you tighten them up a little bit? Or, you might get some unreasonable requests at the same time, and that is one of the difficult parts of an owner-occupied fourplex building, like I mentioned. But just to remember, with that FHA program, you only need to live there a minimum of 12 months, but it's not always going to be convenient.
When tenants don't do what you want them to do, like pay their rent on time, is it best to handle that by being passive aggressive and just like not looking at them or talking to them? Or is it better to like issue threats like, I know where you live, like you better watch your back. Like I'd hate for something to happen to your car tonight. Like what's the best way to deal with those kind of conflicts?
Well, first of all, the worst way is just to trust them and say that they're just going to pay you a couple days late. The best thing to do is just to nip that in the bud. And in most states, you need to post that tenant with a notice saying just how much rent is due, how late it is, what they need to do to remedy it, and some other things. But as far as from a human and tenant relations standpoint, one very powerful sentence, just some magic words I've found to tell a tenant about the fact that you posted that notice oftentimes on their door or maybe handing it to them, are these 7 magic words. Just say, the law says that I have to. When they're late with the rent and with that official form, you say, well, the law says that I have to. It kind of shows that it's not confrontational. It's not between you and the tenant. It's about the law. I found that to be a very powerful statement. They'll know you're serious, but it's not between you and them. It's really kind of what you agreed to.
I know, Keith, right now, we're sort of, I guess I don't know exactly, but I feel like we're in sort of like a bubble-ish economy. Like property values are super high. Seems like they've just been going up and up and up and up. And given where we're at in the market and the economy today, do you think, like, is this a good time to be jumping into the real estate investing game? Or if you've already been doing it for a while, is it a good time to be buying? And yes or no, what would be your reasoning behind that?
I'm still buying real estate. In fact, I just got a couple properties under contract again about 10 days ago, 2 more turnkey properties. So I'm still a buyer. I really don't know where a better place is to put one's money for a relatively passive return. But yes, Seth, you're bringing up something very contemporaneous and germane, and that is, well, prices are higher, and now interest rates, starting a couple years ago, they have begun to come up as well. Well, on an inflation-adjusted basis, in many metros, prices really aren't any higher than they were 10 years ago. A lot of places hit their pre-recession peak about 10 years ago, but if you factor in about 25% total inflation over 10 years, which is just a rate of 2 or 2.5% per year, we're actually not above those yet. And really a lot of the reasons I'm buying, I think that can be grouped into 3 different areas. I would call them demographic reasons, geographic reasons, and psychographic reasons as to why today is a good time to be a new real estate investor. And we can go through the rates of return later. But for one thing, 30-year mortgage interest rates are still pretty close to their historic lows. Freddie Mac has been tracking mortgage interest rates since 1971. It's difficult to get good data before that. But I can tell you what the average 30-year fixed amortizing, just plain vanilla loan interest rate is since Freddie began tracking rates almost 50 years ago. It's 7.7% for a primary residence. So it's probably close to 8.7% for a non-owner occupied rental, because you usually pay more when you don't live in the property. So rates are still historically low. On a primary residence, you can still get under 5. On a rental, probably pretty close to 6 today. So in a rising rate environment, most investors, they have a sense of urgency. They want to buy more property before rates go higher. And the Fed has already told us they're going to raise rates 1 more time this year and 3 more times next year. It's when rates go down that people get a sense of complacency. People should have a sense of complacency when rates are going down, because you figure that if you postpone a purchase, you're going to get a lower rate in a few months. So if you think interest rates are going to be 8% in 2 years, which some seem to think it could be something like that, you're going to look back and be happy that you bought now. That's why I'm buying more now. The Fed has told us what they're going to do. From a demographic perspective, the millennials are the largest age group cohort in U.S. history. They're even larger than the baby boomers now. So you really want to track what millennials are doing. And what's part of the millennial experience today? They have student loan debt, and they paid tuition that's greater than it's ever been on an inflation-adjusted basis. So what's really happened to all these millennials and these college graduates is they're saddled with more student loan debt than they've ever had. You read stories about that all the time. Well, what the heck's that have to do with a real estate investor? Well, those big student loan debt amounts mean that millennials, this biggest group ever, has a difficult time forming a down payment for housing. So when they can't form a down payment for housing, that makes them become a renter instead. In fact, home ownership rates are at long-term lows. The home ownership rate in the U.S. is only about 64% today, down from its recent high of 69% earlier this century, the 2000s. So there are really some good demographic reasons for that. You know, this is a reason, Seth and Jaron, that just everyone overlooks, especially when people are born and raised in the United States, and that's just our population continues to increase. The U.S. population increases at about 0.7% every year, and they all need to live somewhere. So just naturally, demand just keeps increasing, going up and up and up. And you take that for granted, but places like Japan and Greece and Spain have shrinking populations, and that causes excess housing capacity in places like that. So rental occupancy is really high for a lot of these reasons. People can't own, and that demand is good for real estate investors like us. So those are some of the demographic and geographic reasons. Really, the last one that I give is something that I call a psychographic reason. These millennials, they saw what happened to their parents about 10 years ago. They saw their parents lose their home, or even if they didn't lose their home, their parents were underwater on the home, so maybe they couldn't move if they had wanted to move. So millennials kind of have this psychographic thing that happened in their formative years that made them think, hey, maybe homeownership really isn't so great. So these are a lot of the reasons I'm buying. So much of it has to do with the demographics that are set up for the next 10 plus years for real estate investors.
What makes a country's population go down, like Japan and Spain and Greece? Do you have any idea? Just curious.
Yeah, it's the birth rate in an awful lot of them. I think economic factors and outmigration are a second one, but a lot of them, especially Japan, it's more of a birth rate being lower than the death rate.
Okay.
Something that fortunately has not happened in the U.S. We grow at about 2 million people per year here in a nation of 330 million people.
Sure. Now, switching gears a little bit, Keith, I know you wrote a book, was it like a year and a half ago now, called 7 Money Myths That Are Killing Your Wealth Potential? I really like the book from the standpoint of, like, it's short. I'm always a fan of short books. It's a fairly easy read. It's easy to understand the concepts you're talking about, but it really talks about a lot of things that fly in the face of like conventional financial wisdom that a lot of us learned growing up. There's 7 myths, but I know one of them that stuck out to me. We can probably cover some of the others briefly here too, but one of the ones that stuck out to me was, I think it was myth number 3 about being debt free. And you go into detail about this concept of like owning a house that's paid off. That's actually, like, financially speaking, not that smart, because that's money that you could have working for you, producing a lot more income rather than having it tied up with your home equity, which really is not going to be doing a whole lot for you. That was something that was like, I mean, like, I understood what you were saying, like that made sense to me, but like I've always had this almost like a personal pride idea behind living in a house that's paid off. Like, I don't have a mortgage payment. I own this thing free and clear. doesn't matter whatever happens in the economy, everything can crash and nobody can take this house from me because it's mine. It got me to thinking, like at what point is a decision supposed to be made financially versus like based on your emotions or based on principles or that kind of thing? You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the best investors keep emotions apart from cold, hard financial decisions. But I think you're bringing up something interesting because in a primary residence, kind of these touchy-feely things come in, and you do feel sometimes like, well, now would it be best for me to put a dollar into my home and pay that off because that feels good? Or would it be better for me to realize there's an opportunity cost there and that dollar can better be invested somewhere else? I keep minimal equity in my own home, in my primary residence. In fact, when equity accumulates, I am quick to harvest it out and redeploy it and put it into an income property. So really what we're talking about here is the difference between being financially free and being debt-free. Financially free means you can do basically whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do it, and whoever you want to do it with. Being debt-free basically just means I don't owe anyone anything. And being debt-free is not a bad place to be, but I would rather be financially free than debt-free. And a lot of times, if I take steps toward being debt-free, it begins to impair my ability to be financially free, sort of like the example of where I wouldn't want to put additional equity into my home. Home equity is actually unsafe, illiquid, and it has a rate of return of 0. So rather than put another $1 or $100 principal payment into my home, I would rather use it as down payments for income property. You just saw the rates of return that it can generate. And rather, I wouldn't want to put that in my own home. When I make an extra principal payment to the bank on my own home, just say I wanted to take a $100 and make an additional principal payment on my primary residence. Basically, here's what I'm saying to the bank. Hey, Mr. Banker, here's an extra $100. Don't pay me any interest on it. If I need it back, I'll pay you fees and I'll prove to you that I qualify again. So therefore, I would rather invest that in more income property that produces a passive, durable cash flow stream that I don't have to work for. So this is just one very hard example of not trying to be debt-free, but trying to be financially free.
I really like how you just talked right there about differentiating between debt-free and financially free. I think for some weird reason, part of my brain always thought those two things were synonymous, but like they're totally not.
Yeah.
Like they have nothing to do with each other for the most part.
Well, I want to give a little bit of pushback. I hope you guys are okay with that. Like,
let's hear it.
Let's have a RE tipster debate, a little bit, right?
Yeah.
There's a guy that comes to mind. He's a friend of mine named LD Stauffer. And he spends 6 months out of the year traveling the world. Total 4-hour workweek lifestyle. He owns 3 multi-million-dollar businesses that he set on autopilot. And one of them is real estate. How I knew him is he started buying real estate in Indianapolis, where I was working for Simple Wholesaling. Now, he is the most Dave Ramsey frugal guy I know, like to the point that when he moved to Indianapolis to start a business, instead of staying in hotels, he slept in his car because he wanted to intentionally be uncomfortable to force him to actually get traction going with the apartment business that he started in Indianapolis. So talking to him at length, he is a stickler to say that on paper, debt makes sense, but there is an aspect of having to pay monthly payments every single month that adds a level of stress that from a lifestyle component is not worth it to him, to the point where he's like extreme, like doesn't take out equity lines of credit, buys all of his houses, cash. And I know that on paper, it makes sense to leverage, but can you speak to that point of like, hey, well, he can go off for 6 months out of the year and not have to worry about anything. Whereas most people who have leverage, like if they take their foot off the gas pedal, the bills are still going to be coming at the end of the month.
Yeah, Jaron, I think you bring up something interesting. There are a few mindsets around this. $1 of debt is not $1 of debt is not $1 of debt. What I mean is if someone has unsecured debt on an 18% APR credit card, yeah, I think it makes sense to retire that debt. If someone has a 4% car loan Well, that is in your name. You do have to pay that debt yourself. But if you retire that 4% car loan, you're paying an opportunity cost. If you don't pay it off, you have the ability to use what we call arbitrage, which is borrowing at a lower rate, say 4% on your car, and investing at a higher rate, say an 8% cash on cash return on real estate, and exploiting the difference, those 4 points of arbitrage. So a lot of this is about opportunity cost. And I heard you talk about how your friend is, maybe being worried, just that, like, this debt is some cloud hanging over him. So he just like to retire that and get that out of his mind. Well, again, I think about being pragmatic and not emotional. And here's the other thing. When you have most of your debt, like I do, all of it tied up in cash flowing rental properties, I have just reliably outsourced my debt payments to tenants. I've outsourced that, and it's secured with 4 walls and a roof, a place that they need to live in. So they had better make that payment. So with real estate, I have the ability to reliably outsource every bit of my debt. So that's really one mindset there. And again, the market and the team are more important than the property. You want to buy real estate in a market that has good economies and diverse economic sectors with a competent manager. So it's not just about passive income, it's about the durability of that income stream. I have millions of dollars in debt, and I'm looking for more because this is good debt where I'm using it for leverage and arbitrage.
So like just practically though, like what if your system goes wrong? Like what if something happens where there's a snowball effect, especially like when we talk about stuff like the burst strategy, right? Like where you're getting the property, fixing it up, and then getting an equity line of credit, taking it and buying another property, and rinse and repeat. And you build this whole financial system based on millions of dollars in debt. And then like all of a sudden you have a major property that blows up or something crazy happens, which is very unlikely that would happen, but it can happen where all of a sudden, like, the snowball effect can throw off all of the things that are covering your payments, and you can be on the hook, right? Are you tracking with me?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. What if, say, you own 40 rental doors and all 40 doors are in one apartment building in just one town?
Right.
Well, I think that's an awful strategy, personally. Market diversification is important. I think it's important to be in multiple geographic markets. What happened during the last downturn 10 years ago, which is the worst recession this country had seen in 70 years since the Great Depression, a lot of markets in the Midwest and South, they didn't really fall by very much. And those on the coasts had awful losses, 50, 60% losses in capital value, and some job losses as well. So being in multiple markets is really important toward hedging yourself. But if you're looking for a 100% guarantee of anything, this is investing. There isn't any guarantee of anything. Even money parked inside the bank isn't 100% safe. So it's about being in multiple economies. I think there's more risk. Some investors take on more risk than they need to. If an investor lives in a small town of 12,000 people and half the employment in that town is tied to the zinc mine that's just outside the town, and the zinc prices tank and the zinc mine has to lay off 2/3 of their staff, well, that investor probably has a real problem because their income stream are tied to tenants that have lost their jobs. So kind of inverse, 180 degrees opposite from just investing in one town where you're only in one or two industries and economic sectors. You really need to broaden out and think about durability. So when I buy a property for cash flow, I actually don't even buy it thinking too much about the tenant that's in there now, although I do. I'm also thinking about what's going to happen 18 months down the road when that tenant leaves. Is there a reasonable expectation that this economy is diverse and vibrant enough so that there will be another tenant there to pay the rent? So that's my mindset on things going wrong.
No, it makes sense. It's just because I understand, again, on paper that you can essentially make more money because you can do more deals when you leverage. But I don't know, man, there's still something, and I can't put my finger on it because, again, like on paper, it makes sense. But there's something about just the freedom of not having to pay anything except property taxes. You know what I mean? Like I go back and forth on my approach to debt, but there's the whole Dave Ramsey concept. And we were talking with Lucas Hall and a bunch of real estate people at FinCon. I'd really like to see a debate between like a rep from Dave Ramsey's team and like somebody in real estate, and just have them go at it because, you talk about leasing a car, right? Like yeah, I could get a car for the next 2 years and I'm just paying $200 a month, and I could take the money that I would spend on paying the car off and then invest it in real estate and make a higher return. But every time I've gone into debt, I've never at the end of the day had money. Every time I've had like a lot of money in my account, it's always when I've cut up my credit cards and I've like been like, no, I'm going to just be debt free as much as I possibly can, you know?
I know from the banking world, I don't know that this was like a written rule anywhere, but the attitude that I got from a lot of other underwriters and analysts was business debt, if it's cash flowing good debt, is not really a problem. Personal debt is a problem. If it's my personal house, if it's not generating any income for me, it's just me having to pay that for my income. But then like on the business side, why not have debt if it's going to be for a business expense that's going to help you make more money? And I think it's probably just a more conservative spin on what Keith is saying, where I could also take my personal home equity and use that for business too. So it's like I'm kind of like holding myself back. But in terms of like my own just personal convictions and like my psychological peace of mind, I think what I'll probably do is like pay my house off, knowing that there's better ways to use that money, but I just want that gone out of my life. And then on the business front, bring on the debt as long as it's paying for itself and then some. Like, I don't really see the problem with that.
You know, I think another mindset as well, since we've touched on a few times, using equity from one's primary residence to invest in some other things, is the fact that that's some of the best debt I possibly have access to is the mortgage principal in my own home. Besides being at a low rate, it's also tax deductible potentially. So it's potentially at a very low rate. And additionally, the mindset around me using equity from my own home to put into income property, just think about this. No equity was lost when I do that. Instead, equity is merely transferred from my home into other properties. So now it's actually safer because I have the opportunity to divide the equity and have it in multiple geographic markets. And we were just talking about how much risk there is in only being in one market or being in fewer markets. So I'll just remind you that when one does that, equity is not lost. Equity is merely transferred. I can't really see any scenario in which I would ever want to have my home paid off, in fact, because over time, say I have a 30-year loan on my own home, which I do, say I accelerated that and paid it off in 20 years. We already talked about some of the deleterious effects of doing that and the loss of opportunity and the loss of leverage. But if I pay that off in 20 years, my housing payment might only be cut in half. All I did was retire the mortgage payment, the principal and interest. I'm still going to have to pay property taxes. I'm still going to have to pay insurance, maintenance, repairs, HOA. And additionally, over time, your principal and interest payment stays fixed. All of those other expenses that persist, they're going to be inflation adjusted. So by the time I would pay it off in 20 years on a 30-year loan, I really might only cut my housing payment in half. So even if I achieve that after blood and sweat and my own toil and my own work and my own lost cash flow by putting more principal into my home, I'm not going to feel like I've won. I haven't even eliminated my housing payment. I've only reduced it.
Yeah, I actually know somebody who lives on, one of the nicer lakes in my area. And maybe this is like not a big deal in other parts of the country, but here it's a lot. She's paying $16,000 a year in property taxes alone, which when you do the math on that, that's over $1,000 per month just in property taxes. So like she can pay off her loan all she wants. She still has this massive annual expense that she's got to cover if she wants to keep that house. So that is it's a valid point. I mean, it's not like you ever completely escape a payment. You can just kind of minimize that payment if you pay it off.
And you bring up a great point, because even if you retire your mortgage balance, you could still lose your home. The government could still take it over if you don't make your property tax payment. And paying off your mortgage loan doesn't do anything to reduce your property tax payment. And, I still have as much enjoyment of the premises of my home. We're still playing croquet on the front lawn of my home in the summertime, whether I'm 90% leveraged on my own home like I am, or whether I have the whole thing paid off. So, it doesn't affect my quality of life at all. In fact, if I did have my home paid off, it might affect my quality of life because I've realized I've lost all my leverage and I've just made a really poor investment decision. I don't know if you know Dave Zook. He's a pretty prominent investor and apartment building syndicator. I love Dave Zook's quote, and it really encompasses a lot of this. Either you can be conventional or you can be wealthy. I love that quote. I think there's so much to that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that.
I can't help but think of the Gordon Gekko quote from Wall Street, where he says, I don't throw darts at a board. I bet on sure things. And granted, the context of that quote is talking about like getting illegal trade secrets and stuff, but still, like that idea of I don't put my money in anything unless I'm like very, very, very sure that this can only work in my favor. And like you're saying, Keith, I mean, there's no such thing as 100% guarantee, but you can get pretty close to that a lot of times if you're smart about it. The pieces of land that Jaron and I buy, I mean, even there, like there's no guarantee, but when you're buying something for like 10% of its, I mean, this was what I was doing back in 2008, 2009 in Michigan, worst state in the country economically. And I was still able to make money and sell properties fast because I was buying something that was basically a sure thing. And you're paying almost nothing for something that has a very certain value to it, or at least pretty certain it's more than what you paid for it. So I think, if you diversify, if you buy properties at the right price, if you know the projected cash flow is there, I think it can be actually kind of hard to get hurt if you set it up the right way.
You and Jaron each have skills in land investing that I don't have. People look to me for long-term buy and hold passive real estate investing. So I guess, would you even feel better putting an extra $1,000 principal payment in your home versus investing in more land like you just described? And there's no right or wrong answer there. It just comes down to how you feel.
It's super tough because like if I can spend $100 to have the power of $1,000 that can make me $10,000 every single time, I will say yes to that situation. But I think maybe for me personally, where the line needs to be drawn is with credit cards, because business debt, like when I'm borrowing or if I'm partnered with somebody on a deal, makes sense every time. It's a great situation. But when it comes to consumer debt or student loan debt or even like car debt, for me, I don't think it makes sense because yes, technically like I could take that money and do something with it, but it's just there's just this stress factor, this added level of like, man, I have this other car bill I have to pay, or I have to pay this, I have to pay that. You know what I mean? So for me, like, I think it really does just boil down to where your personal risk tolerance and just really like your pain points in your life. Like I want to get a house hack situation here in Chicago because like I ran the numbers and I could live on something like $2,500 a month all in if I lived where I had no mortgage, in Chicago, which I mean, in other areas that sounds expensive, but like that's food, that's everything. That's like my bare minimum thing. If I could cut out my monthly payments. And so I want to be able to be in a situation where all my expenses are as low as humanly possible so that I can have freedom. And like you were going back to what you were saying, that sometimes you can get to that point faster with leverage, smart leverage. But I would just caution people, like, make sure it's actually smart, because if you get into a bad situation, that can really, really bite you and get you in a situation where not only are you now on the hook for your living expenses, but now you have another few $1,000s that you're on the hook for a few months while you're looking for another tenant. You just have to make sure that you set it up properly.
Yeah, well said. That goes back to what we were talking about near the beginning of this. Stop looking at properties. Some people get all excited about the property and just want to jump in. Whoa, let's pull back. Let's be strategic. The property is only the fourth most important thing. What was number one? It starts with you. What's going to work for you? What's your confidence level? How good of an investor are you? How much liquidity do you like to keep? How risk averse are you? It all starts with you.
Yeah, there's we could do several more episodes just talking about these other myths, because there's lots we can dig into. I guess what I would do is, if you're listening to this, if you want to learn more about some of these money myths, I thought all the points Keith made in his book were very good. Good to at least think through and be aware of. Again, it's 7 money myths that are killing your wealth potential.
We're coming right back with more. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Finally, Total Control Financial gives you checkbook control of your 401k and IRA money to invest in real estate. It's time to get your retirement money into your own checking account, but you've got to avoid the little-known tax that you'll pay with any self-directed IRA. Instead, it's time for the QRP. Learn more and get your free copy of the QRP book by text messaging QRP in all capital letters to 72,000. For a real estate investor like you seeking an income property loan, go to Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. Over the years, you've heard President Chaley Ridge generously devote her time to you here on the show as a guest. Ridge provides investment property loans in most U.S. states, and you're going to find out how they've helped more people realize their dreams of real estate financial freedom than any other mortgage lender in the entire nation when you get started at ridgelendinggroup.com.
Hi, this is Russell Gray, co-host of the Real Estate Guys radio show, and you're listening to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. I hope you enjoyed that chat where I was interviewed by Seth Williams and Jaron Barnes, two great guys. And if you want to hear the entire interview or see more of their great resources, check out their website at retipster.com. That will be in the show notes. I really appreciate Seth and Jaron for digging in and using some debate in the interview. That's what helped make for a great chat. Now, I actually can think of a number of good reasons to retire debt and disregard the wealth-building benefits of prudent leverage at times. If a property isn't financeable for you and you must pay cash, then if you still find it a worthwhile venture, you'll pay cash and you might retain the option of performing a cash-out refinance later. Now, I also remember that when I was younger and newer to real estate, I had a mortgage loan underwriter tell me that to qualify for my next income property loan, I had to pay off my 5% interest rate car loan so that my debt to income ratio met their qualification threshold. That was annoying, but I did it in order to add a property. Now, you might want to keep some equity cushion in your own home, 20%, 30%, 40%, to avoid being in an underwater condition on your primary residence, avoiding where your mortgage balance is higher than your property value. After the mortgage mess of 2009, some underwater homeowners couldn't move because they couldn't sell their home. They had negative equity, so a sale of their home wouldn't pay off their lien holder. But I really think there are three conditions in which an investor would even want to consider this defensive underwater avoidance stance. Number one is the case that you feel like you might want to sell your primary residence and move in the next few years. Number two is that the cash flows in your life are not that strong or durable. And number three, if you think that the real estate market that your home resides in could decline steeply in value in the near term. If you deem all three of those conditions to be true, then you're less likely to want to cut your primary residence equity cushion too thinly. Now, home equity has zero ROI, but borrowing against it exacts an interest rate expense. And as I've discussed at length elsewhere, for safety, if you transfer home equity into an income property, the cash-on-cash return payment from your investment property needs to meet or exceed any additional interest rate payment that you make on your primary residence. So if your income property generates $3,000 of annual cash flow and your HELOC expense is $1,800 per year, well, you are $1,200 ahead. And be mindful that HELOC rates are likely to trend higher for a while, not lower. In fact, just last Wednesday, flying in the face of condemnation by President Trump, the Jerome Powell-led Fed hiked interest rates 1/4 of a point. Again, the Fed funds rate is now in a range of 2.25% to 2.5%.
We are doing great as a country. Unfortunately, they just raised interest rates a little bit because we are doing so well. I'm not happy about that because I know it's going to be a question. I am not happy about that.
Now, let's talk about short-term gyrations versus long-term strategy. Yesteryear, 3 decades ago, you might have had to use an ink pen to write a paper check every month to service your mortgage or HELOC debt, put it in a paper envelope, affix a stamp, and drop it in the mail, and maybe you had more time to contemplate the HELOC payment you're making. Today, you can just look electronically and see the positive arbitrage in your bank account, see if you have more income than expenses. There's arguably even less thought behind it and less emotion behind it today. If you think real estate is going to be worth more over the long term, the next 10, 20, 30 years, well, with leverage, you can perhaps lock up $4 million worth of real estate rather than $1 million of paid off real estate. So I'd ask you, over the long term then, do you want to control more real estate or less? Now, rather than looking ahead, let's look behind. On a national basis, over the last 30 years, basically the year 1989, when I was in grade school, up to the present day, what have real estate values done? They have increased massively over those 30 years. What have they done over the last 20 years? Since 1999, they have gone up substantially. What's it done over the last 10 years, since 2009? Well, you know what? It actually hasn't moved all that much. It isn't often where you can find a 10-year slice where real estate hasn't substantially appreciated nationally, and it took a colossal mortgage meltdown, an awful recession, the Great Recession, just to be about break even on appreciation over the last 10 years. My point is, for the leveraged investor, what is on your side? Time. It's a long-term game. That's why I count on leverage as a long-term wealth creator, but it's imperative for it to be controlled with cash flows. You are going to be alive for the long term, I hope, so play long-term proven strategies that are worth winning. I don't own any cryptocurrency. I stick with proven strategies. Decide slowly, then commit for the long term. I've been married to the same woman for more than 11 years, a long-term commitment worth winning. I've never missed a single week of hosting the show here since the year Get Rich Education launched in 2014. Long-term commitment. I think that some people that get to know me think I have an unusually strong emphasis on regular physical exercise. Long-term commitment. Whatever you do, your body is one that you're going to be living in for the long term. Now let's balance this too. Long-term commitments in your life, that doesn't mean that you're forever inflexible. If mortgage interest rates were 15 to 18% again, like they were in the early 1980s, you would probably reevaluate leverage. Of course, high interest rates, though, that typically means high inflation, and inflation is a debtor's best friend. And someday, if robots can exercise for you, you might reevaluate exercise as well. Another thing for you to consider is that if you originate a 30-year loan for your own home and just make the exact, say you have a $2,500 PITI payment for the entire term, 360 months, which is 30 years, your monthly housing payment expense is actually trending lower with each passing month. Why? That's because your principal and interest are not inflation adjusted. That payment remains fixed. So therefore, your $2,500 monthly home payment today will only diminish your prosperity by perhaps $2,000 per month in a few years, and then just $1,500 per month in a few more years. So over time, your monthly primary residence payment just continues to trend lower and lower in real inflation-adjusted terms. The payment becomes less formidable with each passing year. Inflation is a long-term phenomenon. Align yourself with what's happening long-term. Inflation transfers wealth from lenders to borrowers. Just look at the last 100 years of the dollar. Home equity is actually an even worse investment than we have had time to discuss today. I first covered this most extensively way back on episode 6 in late 2014, where we get into all the reasons and the substantial risks to having a lot of equity in your own home. And you know what? It's amazing. Commonly, when I meet a Get Rich Education follower or listener in person for the first time to this day, it's incredible how often they tell me that episode 6 is still the most important show that they've ever heard. Now, the oldest real estate investor I know, sorry about that, Bob, is the godfather of real estate, Bob Helms. He's been investing in real estate since 1957. Bob says that almost every time when you have a chance to get leverage, take it. To paraphrase my longtime friend and sidekick and Get Rich Education contributor here, John Collins, he recently told me something in a really interesting way. John said that one of the most powerful ideas around debt is that you can use money that the Fed printed out of thin air to acquire and take title to a real, physical, tangible asset and income stream. I thought that was great. And the more you understand about banks and fractional reserve lending, you understand that dollars are essentially conjured up out of thin air. Next week, the real estate guys, Russell Gray, will be back on the show with us. Russ and I have each been traveling to different real estate investing conferences the last few weeks. So together, Russ and I will tell you what we're seeing in today's real estate market with respect to affordability, interest rates, inflation, the increased flow of institutional dollars in real estate, and a lot more, and what that means to you as an investor as we tilt into the new year. Well, if you found today's show thought-provoking, I would love it if you told a friend either around the dinner table at the holidays or by taking a screenshot of this episode on your phone and sharing it on your Facebook, your Instagram, your Twitter, or your LinkedIn. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Happy holidays. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
As America's third largest city, Chicago, Illinois has big economies of scale for real estate investors. But there are problems with investing in highly taxed, fiscally strapped Illinois. You can beat it when you invest in Chicago land, staying on the Indiana side of the state line. Your property tax on a median Indiana home is less than half that of an Illinois property. Forbes ranks Indiana as one of the top 10 states to do business. With typical rents at $1,250 and purchase prices at $125K, Northwest Indiana numbers work. Learn more and connect with the turnkey provider at GetRichEducation.com/Chicago. That's GetRichEducation.com/Chicago.
71% of Americans aren't saving enough for retirement. It's going to get worse as people live longer, and you need to start thinking differently. But you can't lose your time. Real estate is the investment vehicle that's made more ordinary people wealthy than anything else. Keith Weinhold of Get Rich Education is host of one of America's top investing shows, Disrupting Wall Street. He's an international best-selling author, a writer for Rich Dad Advisors, and has been an active income property investor since 2002. He has created thousands in passive monthly income for countless followers, and now he has a free book, The 7 Principles for Creating Wealth in Your Life. Get your copy now at GetRichEducation.com/book. That's GetRichEducation.com/book. Because invest in what produces income for you now and later. Sign up now at GetRichEducation.com/book.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.